Thanks for having me back here again to talk to you about a really interesting subject, the power of peer review, and to try in the next few minutes to make you understand why this is important to you, why it's going to make you a better clinician, why it's going to make the clinicians around you better, and actually directly affect patient care, and for you to see that actually happening in practice. But before we get on to the practicalities, the science, and a bit of the psychology behind this, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. And these are designed to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. So that's OK if you do find it. The first one is this. How good are you? And let's take a little focus here, because we're quite a broad tribe of different grades, different ages, different specialties. Let's think about your management of the critically ill and the critically injured patient. How good are you? Well, have a think. Maybe give yourself a score. Maybe give yourself some qualitative idea about whether you're good or not. Got that? And then question 2, which is a little bit more challenging, I'm afraid. How do you know? How do you know really where your strengths and your weaknesses are? How do you know those little places where you can improve? Perhaps where you're unconsciously incompetent or really competent. Perhaps these areas which you really show excellence. How do you know? How do you know what good looks like for us, the people who work in the environments that we do? Well, in other areas, we know what good looks like. So who's this guy? Roger Federer? Roger Federer is quite good at tennis. I'm pretty certain about this. Not only that, he's been good at tennis for a very long period of time. He's really good. We know that. We can see it. We can easily evaluate it. And when we see it in sport, when we see it in music and the arts, we know we have a good feeling for what that is. But what about you? What about us in the complex environments that we work in? Well, we could think about many things, but I'm going to take just a couple of them to think about today to use as a vehicle to talk about peer review. And the first is, and especially amongst this audience, you want to be as good as you can be. You want to achieve, I think, that idea of Maslow's from the 1960s, a psychologist who talked about this concept of self-actualization, that you are doing as well as you can do and you're fulfilled in your job. And what I particularly like about that is it's about the individual. It doesn't matter whether you're doing ECMO in Melbourne or you're working in a rural emergency department in South America. It's independent of what system you're in. It's about you. And everybody here would share that sentiment, I'm sure. And the second is about the work that we do. All of us, pre-hospital, emergency medicine, anesthesia, critical care, whatever, have to deal with situations where we are required to make decisions which are complex, time-critical, and information-light, in that we don't exactly know what's going on. We have to make the decision now. And actually, we'd like a lot more information, but we don't actually have it. And those consequences could be profound for the patient, and in many cases, ourselves. And that's an area of practice which I think unites all of us. So let's have a think about those things as we go through and have an idea about how peer review might work to help us develop those skills. Let's keep it simple. Let's take an example of how it might work in an emergency department, which is where I work. It might be that I'm on call for the ED, and I'm required to lead the trauma team, lead the cardiac arrest teams, lead the emergencies in the resus room. That's going to be my job for the day. And what could happen is I could get one of my colleagues to come out, perhaps, and spend some time in the resus room with me. They've got time to observe, stand back, to interview people, to see what goes on, maybe use an aid memoir. And in my part of the world, we use something called a team debriefing sheet, which is based on simulation debriefing. Because let's think about it. Peer review of an actual case, is that not very similar to the type of in-situ simulation that we say we don't often have time for? We can achieve this because it's happening all the time. Someone comes in, they do some observation, they make some notes, they do some interpretation, they explore some ideas, and then perhaps a little later on we sit down and we go through what happened, with the focus not necessarily on what happened, although you've got to talk about that, or whether it was the right thing to do, although to some extent you've got to talk about that as well, but why. Because if a core thing about what we do is decision-making, I'm interested in why people make decisions just as much as what the decision was. So how did you handle that uncertainty? How did you understand that probable problem? How did you how did you cope with the fact that the results that came back from the blood gas didn't meet with what you were seeing at the end of the bed? The two weren't going together. How did you work through that? And through that mechanism, we can sit down and start to explore and improve ourselves. What could be more simple than that? Why aren't we doing this all the time? What's the question there? And why are we talking about it now? The 6th year of SMAC, all these amazing things that we've learned and done whilst we've come here, all the money we've spent to come here, the air miles, I'm putting 12 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere to be here. The opportunity cost in terms of time that we're here doing this rather than anything else. It's amazing, but we have a huge responsibility to take the lessons learned here and make them happen back in the workplace. And I don't know what mechanism you have for that, but actually seeing actions in the resus room, changing the way that people behave, challenge them about what they're doing now and saying this is a different way of doing things, this is a different way of thinking, is an excellent way of translating Chris Hicks into resus 4. Think about what you're going to do when you leave here. And then for some of us, the older people here, I'm afraid. When you're a trainee, people watch you all the time. They give you feedback, they do workplace-based assessments, you do exams, you jump through hoops, you have portfolios, you get feedback. What happens when you become an attending or a consultant? Do you suddenly not need that? How many people over the age of 50, such as myself here, have been observed and had feedback on their clinical performance in the last few years? For many people, very rare. Many, many years for most of us. For some people sat here today, it'll be decades. And there's actually data out there to suggest that we have a problem. Clinicians as they age, if you look at their performance, starts to fall off, notably above the age of 50. But actually, there's a recent paper published in the BMJ which shows that the mortality of your patients rises after the age of 30. Admittedly, that was in general physicians in the US. It wasn't like us. But there's a definite trend there that as you get older, perhaps your performance does not get better in the way that experience would suggest that it should. Now, there are exceptions. The more you do, the more you educate, the more you keep in process and you learn new things, that rise in mortality is potentially mitigated. Certainly over the age of 60, the mortality rates go up substantially. So if you're grey-haired like me, who's giving you feedback? Or are you reliant on what you learned 20 years ago? A question for you. Let's have a quick think about peers, because selecting who's going to do this is important. In general, you want somebody who is fairly familiar to you, because if it's somebody who you've never met before, the trust, the openness, the fairness, and the honesty might be difficult to generate. But on the other hand, if it's somebody who's very well known to you, they might not be honest. You've had the experience of shopping with a partner, I'm sure, and they ask you if your bum looks bigger in these pair of jeans. The answer is rarely yes. But that might be different if you're employing somebody as a fashion advisor. So there's probably a Goldilocks moment about who's perfect. But in reality, opportunity is what drives this in our practice. It's finding somebody who's on an admin day in the back office or in a quieter area of the department. Because quite frankly, if somebody says to me, do you want to stop doing administration and come into resus and see something exciting? That's not a difficult decision. And it's also important thinking about the peers, about who benefits from this. So there's obviously the person who's being watched. That's kind of what you think this is going to be all about. And to some extent it is. The person who's being watched will benefit. But the organization does as well. One of the reasons we started doing this is the feedback from our nurses and junior doctors to say that, to be honest, the behaviors of the senior consultants was completely different depending on which shift was on, which day of the week it was, and who was running things. And we as the seniors had no idea that that was happening, or we chose not to believe it. So calibration in your organization is a tool, is a problem that can be resolved through this. But the most interesting thing for us, and I think was unexpected, was it's the person who's doing the watching who benefits the most. They've got more bandwidth. They're not in the zone. They can see what's going on. They can interview people, and they can find out what the effect is of the team leader or a team member or anybody in the room. That's important because it means everybody benefits. It means it's more sustainable. It's not a chore. So I have convinced you. Is everybody going to go away from here next week, arrange some peer review, get somebody in the resus room, and follow them and tell them whether they're doing well, whether they're doing badly, and how they can improve? Well, when I put this talk together, I was convinced, because I'm convinced by this, it's great. But several of my colleagues were really skeptical. They said, I don't need this. I know myself, I know where my strengths and weaknesses are, and I can work on them. True story. So I'm going to try and convince you that you're wrong. I'm trying to convince you do not know yourself. I'll give you 2 examples. The first is your basic senses. You're all familiar with the idea that when you hear yourself played back in audio, you don't sound the way that you think you sound in your head? You don't know yourself. But even more fundamentally than that, your body image, you've never seen yourself. For most people, the reality of what they perceive they look like, the only time you see a live, 3D, life-size image of yourself is in a mirror. But it's a mirror image. It's backwards. Now, you can get things called 3D mirrors or non-reversing mirrors, which show you as you truly are. And when you show this to people, they find it's really weird, for starters. Some people find it quite amusing. A lot of people find it quite disturbing because they don't understand how the rest of the world sees them. And that's the same for you. You judge yourself from what your perception of how you're seen in the world is, not the reality. But that's just your image. What about your decisions and things? There's a big factor here about how we're not able to judge ourselves, and it's the difference between our intentions and our impact. So it might be, let's think of an example. I'm in the trauma room, and we've got a very complicated, very difficult resuscitation going on. I've got some quite dominant personalities in the room. And so I decide that what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my language, my body posture, the way I talk to people, my sentence construction, to get control of the room again. So my intention is to get control. It changes my actions. And my impact is I think things have gone well. I've been assertive. It's been great. My impact actually might be that I'm a bully. And I won't know that. And not only that, if somebody says, Simon, you're a bit harsh today, you're a bit on it, I will judge myself entirely by my intention and not my impact. So I cannot even judge myself because I'm full of bias. And there are many more reasons as well, but these are factors why you cannot know yourself, but those around you know you. Peer review is a tool to break those barriers, and that's why I think you should be thinking about doing it. Particularly as you fly away from SMAC, you leave Sydney, you go back to your departments, you go back to the ideas about taking the translational knowledge from here and putting it into practice with real patients in the resus room and real behaviors with your colleagues and with yourself. It's free. Everybody here can do it. You can do it at any age, with any tribe, in any specialty, in any country. So why not? Give it a try and let me know how you go. So as we finish, I'm going to leave you with our friend Roger. Now, I've not worked with Roger, so I don't actually know how he came to be the best tennis player in the world, best male tennis player in the world, and how he managed to stay at that level for such a long period of time. But I'm fairly confident that he didn't do it by judging himself. I'm pretty confident he had colleagues, peers, coaches, other tennis players who were able to look at his game and tell him where he really was working well, where he could improve, where his strengths are, where he could dominate, and where he could develop even further. So my question to you is, if you're better at clinical medicine than Roger Federer is at tennis, ignore the last 15 minutes. If, on the other hand, you're not as good as medicine as Roger Federer is at tennis, why don't you give peer review a try? Thank you for your time, and thank you from everybody at St. Emlyn's for everything that SMAC does.